Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Manitoba Alumni and Friends Virtual Learning for Life Fall 2020 series. My name is Tracy Bowman. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations and a proud UM alumna and the moderator for today's session. Thank you so much for joining us and making this part of your day. We've been able to offer this program free of charge to our 148,000 alumni living in 140 countries around the world, thanks to the generous sponsorship of one of our affinity partners, IA Financial Group. Many thanks to them. Delivering learning for life opportunities is a very important role for the University of Manitoba, and we are so proud that we're able to showcase many of our leading professors and researchers in this way. So just a few housekeeping details before we get started. In the email confirmation, you would have received the link to the platform Slido. That's www.sli.do. And just a reminder, this is the platform we use to gather questions. The password you will use to enter is VL21, and you'll be able to type in your questions at any point during the presentation. I will be able to see them and I will ask them on your behalf. Feel free to ask follow-up questions as well, or if perhaps I didn't do a great job of asking your question, please just add something again. If we have many questions where we can't get through them all, we will do our very best, and we will follow up later if there's an opportunity after the presentation. So now, before we get into our presentation, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kjell Anderson, who will be presenting on The Dilemma of Dominic Ongwen, a former child soldier on the trial at the International Criminal Court. Now, let me share a few things about Dr. Anderson's very impressive CV. He is the director of the University of Manitoba's new interdisciplinary Masters of Human Rights program, which we're so very excited about. He is a jurist and social scientist specializing in the study of human rights, mass violence, and mass atrocities. He's the author of a number of works, including the one that we're going to be hearing about today. His work experience encompasses advocacy for victims of torture and sexual violence in Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, for FACT Rwanda. He leads the Rule of Law program at the Hague Institute for Global Justice, is working at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on Indigenous Issues, acts as a legal researcher at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and also teaches, besides at the University of Manitoba, a number of universities around the world. His current research focuses on perpetrators of international crimes, the criminology of genocide, transitional justice, and the Dominic Ongwen trial at the International Criminal Court. And with that, over to you, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you very much, Tracy. I'll just get my PowerPoint going here. So thank you, Tracy. Thank you to everybody as well for joining me today. I'm very glad to be here. And today I'll be speaking on what I think is a very thorny issue, namely victims of mass atrocities who go on to become perpetrators of mass atrocities. Namely, I'll be talking about child soldiers in northern Uganda. These individuals were forcibly conscripted. They were actually abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army, which is led by Joseph Kony. I think some of you have probably heard of Joseph Kony. And Dominic Ongwen, the subject of my talk today, was one of these individuals who was abducted by Joseph Kony, or at least by Joseph Kony's forces. I'm not going to focus too much on the politics of the Lord's Resistance Army insurgency or the politics of the conflict. I'm more interested in this situation of victim perpetrators today. But we can say that the insurgency, the Lord's Resistance Army insurgency in northern Uganda, basically went on for several decades. It had a couple of unique characteristics. I mean, it was rooted in the alienation of people in the northern part of Uganda from the central government. But the Lord's Resistance Army itself, of course, is also known for its unusual spiritual practices, through which people who are in the LRA believe, for example, that Joseph Kony can channel several different spirits, and as well that he could read people's minds, that he's got the powers of telepathy. So in some ways, the LRA is certainly a unique group. I think sometimes the uniqueness is overemphasized in a way that kind of exoticizes the LRA, because beyond these practices that are somewhat unusual to us, in many ways, it functions like any other conventional armed force or perhaps any other rebel group. So it's got a chain of command, it's got a hierarchy, it's got an organized structure. So some of the children who were abducted by the LRA, and there were thousands over the course of a couple of decades, went on to become commanders in the group. They stayed in the group for whatever reason, and they eventually became commanders. And Dominic Ongwen is one of these individuals. He was abducted when he was around 11 years old, and this is one of the issues in the trial. To some extent, it's a tangential issue, but how old he was when he was abducted, but he was between 10 and 14 years old, depending who you ask. And he's currently on trial at the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And the trial just ended in March, but we're still waiting for the verdict. So today I'm going to talk about, actually mainly about his life, and I'm also going to speak about the trial and how the court is grappling with the complexities of his personal trajectory, of his life experience. And I'm going to attempt this partly through the stories of people who knew Dominic Ongwen, as well as through their experiences within the LRA, because I think that it makes it more interesting, but at the same time, it's also, I think, important to emphasize the ways that experience also shaped, individual volition and how that relates to criminal law as well. So this is also consistent with the book I'm writing, as Tracy said, about the life and about the trial of Dominic Ongwen. I think the book will be out next year, I hope, late next year. And it's substantially based on stories of people who knew Dominic Ongwen. So this ranges from people who were in the LRA with him, to family members, to people involved in his trial from all sides, really, from defense, prosecution, victim side. But ultimately, I think, and we'll see what you think at the end of the talk, but I think you'll probably have a similar perspective. It's a complicated story. It's a messy story, and ultimately it's a tragic story. And the tragedy, to me, really extends to all sides. It's not only about Dominic Ongwen, but certainly about the people he victimized as well. But we'll talk about all of that today. And because of the nature of the crimes we're talking about, perhaps some of the content will be a little bit disturbing, but I've tried to dampen that down a little bit. So let's begin with Dominic Ongwen's childhood. So Dominic Ongwen had a pretty typical Acholi childhood, Acholi being the ethnic group that he belongs to in north central Uganda. He grew up in Chirome Parish, an area just north of Gulu. Probably most of you don't know where Gulu is, but it would be the main city in northern Uganda. That image on the slide is not of his specific house, but it is of his village, which is very small. I mean, really, we're just talking about a hamlet. So he was born around 1975. Again, some of these dates are disputed. And his name, Dominic Ongwen, or I should say the last part of his name, Ongwen, means white ant. And it refers to the time of year in which he was born, which would be the time of year in which white ants are harvested. So these are flying white ants, and they're actually a delicacy in Acholi land. So, as I said, he grew up in Chirome, or the area of Chirome, about 40 kilometers north of Gulu. The village is one of several villages in the area. As you can see, this is pretty typical for what the villages look like. Clusters of mud brick houses set amidst packed earth compounds, and you would find farm animals within these compounds. And when you go beyond the compounds, then you get into kind of the village hinterland, where you find crops growing, which are mostly root vegetables and leafy greens. But when you go beyond that area, you get into the world of the lum, or the bush, as it's called in the Acholi language. And especially after 1987, this was the realm of the LRA, of the Lord's Resistance Army. So it was an area that was, to some extent, feared by Acholi people. It was also known in some way as the realm of spirits. So I'm telling the story today particularly through the story of his sister, in fact. So he had a fairly idyllic home life, which was described by his sister as peaceful, loving, and welcoming. He was known, and I spoke to many people about this, but he was known as a well-behaved and diligent child who was focused on his studies as well as prayer. His father, he came from a fairly religious family, but that's also quite typical, I think, in that part of the world. His father was a Roman Catholic catechist, as was the father, interestingly enough, of Joseph Kony. And his father was remembered as a man who was a man of integrity without being overly strict, we can say. So as a young boy, his sister would accompany him walking to school and back, which was about 5 kilometers away, as well as preparing food for him. And when he returned from school, he would typically have to sweep the family's compound, herd the farm animals, in this case goats, back into the compound for the night, prepare a bonfire, and then he would study. Sometimes he would also play games. He would play football, for example, which would be one of his favorite games at the time. But this, relative domestic idyll, or at least this domestic normalcy, was soon to be shattered by the wars on the horizon. So Dominic Ongwen, as I've said already, like so many children at that time, and again, we're talking about thousands of children really, was abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army. And he was something like 10 years old, 11 years old. Sometimes the ages range up to 14, but there are different estimates. But his family told me he was 11 specifically. So he was captured on the way to his primary school. As I said, he had to walk 5 kilometers, so he was late due to his morning chores, and he was kind of rushing to school, and with 3 of his friends, and they were ambushed by the Lord's Resistance Army, and all 4 of them were captured and taken by the group. So his sister remembered, in recalling this incident, remembered her despair on finding that Dominic was missing. So she told me, "I'd come to town to buy salt. When I returned, I found that he was already abducted. This incident really depressed me. I cried for 1 week. I could not eat. I did nothing for over a month." And his parents were killed actually soon after he was abducted, perhaps one of them immediately and the other one a couple months later in violent circumstances. It's under dispute exactly what happened to them, but they both died violent deaths, we can say. So he was abducted essentially by the same force that he would one day lead, part of the LRA. One of the boys who was abducted at the same time as Dominic returned to the village after, I think, being away for a week or something like that. And he told Dominic's family that Dominic was being carried because, the story went that he was injured, his legs were swollen, and that he wasn't able to walk. So this really distressed his family at that time as well. They were, needless to say, very concerned about his situation. So like all abductees, Dominic was placed in the household of a senior commander, a series of senior commanders, as I'll explain in a moment. He was likely forced to commit atrocities in his early days in the LRA. And this is something that, again, is fairly typical, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It comes up in his trial, especially in the defense case. So the reason, putting on a more sociological hat here, the reason why people are often forced to perpetrate atrocities in groups like the LRA is because it distances them from their former lives. It produces a lot of shame, even if they're forced to do it. It produces a lot of shame among these individuals, and it also habituates them to violence. They become more used to doing violence. And I'm just going to very briefly tell you a story here just to indicate what many of these children went through. And, again, warning, it is a little bit disturbing. But when I was first in Uganda in 2009, I was going around doing interviews at that time in camps where people who'd returned and escaped from the LRA were being reintegrated back into society. And after doing these interviews for about a week, the person who was driving me around on their motorbike, he didn't really speak much English at all, but he told me, I was also abducted by the LRA. So we stopped and we did an interview, basically just under a tree in a schoolyard. I had a student who was helping me to interpret at that time. And so he started telling me his story of abduction. And in his case, he was abducted with a group of his friends. One of his friends tried to escape. That friend was recaptured. They forced all the other friends to kill that other friend, and then they forced them to drink his blood. So quite disturbing, obviously, but it is indicative of the kinds of violence that a lot of these children are forced to participate in. And this individual that I'm speaking about, even though he was obviously forced to do these things, he had no choice, otherwise he would have been killed himself. He still carried a lot of shame for being involved in these activities. And that's really part of the reason why the LRA also has children and other abductees do these kinds of things. So shifting now to Dominic's early days in the LRA, And for many recruits, as they're called by the LRA, these days are often the most difficult period because they're tightly bound, they're tied tightly at all times, even while they sleep. They have no freedom. Obviously, a lot of these children, well, you could say all the children, I think, are quite terrified at the time because they don't know what's going to happen. They're operating in circumstances of danger, often with a lack of food. They're exhausted. They're forced to march long distances while carrying heavy loads. So this is the first stage of being in the LRA, what they call being a recruit or a karut in the language of the LRA. But needless to say, children, like adults, are pretty resilient, generally speaking, and they do eventually adjust to these circumstances, not to say it doesn't still leave a toll on them afterwards. But Dominic specifically spent time in the households of several different commanders, and I won't name them here, well, partly because I think it's just too much detail, I think, as well. But the reason, I mean, one of the reasons he spent time in the households of several different commanders is because they don't want recruits to develop too close attachments to any specific individual. They don't want them to be loyal to one commander over another commander. And another factor here was that some of the commanders were actually killed at the time. So the LRA operates in some sense with a kind of community structure. So individuals, young children, are placed in these families where they serve kind of as domestic servants while they adjust to the LRA. And it's usually commanders with their wives, and I'm using wife or wives in quotation marks here because they are forced marriages, generally speaking, along with these abductees. That would be a family within the LRA. So I spoke with some of the women who were the wives of commanders who took care of Dominic Ongwen when he was first abducted and when he was a very young child. This quote isn't on the slide. We'll just call her Angie. It's a pseudonym, and we'll return to her story a bit later. But she told me he was a happy boy. He would go around gathering cassava or look for chicken to bring to me to cook. He would say, "Mommy, I've brought this one for you to cook for us." He would also roast cassava and bring it to me and ask for simsim paste. Simsim is just sesame paste. And then take it for the commanders. He was still very young. He was useful for errands here and there. They were using him as a messenger. He would carry chairs for the commander. Even now, if you tell him Mama Angie, he will remember and be happy. Another commander's wife who wasn't raising Dominic, but who knew Dominic very well at that time when he was a young child in the LRA, warned him, "If you escape from here, you will not reach home. The animals will eat you." Others don't listen. They just escape and reach home. But for him, he used to listen and obey. And this wasn't just a kind of idle threat intended to intimidate him. I mean, that's the reason I have the image on the slide as well, because the LRA during these times was operating in fairly remote regions of northern Uganda. And if you did escape as a child and you were trying to make your way back home, first of all, it might be very far. But actually, there were wild animals that were genuinely dangerous alongside other dangers as well. I mean, another thing I would point out here, too, is that both as a child, before he was abducted by the LRA, and also once he was in the LRA, we see this kind of tendency for obedience. And I don't mean that he was some kind of mindless automaton. I mean that I suppose he was respectful and he was dutiful, which actually served him well, in a sense, within the Lord's Resistance Army. It allowed him to survive, and it allowed him to actually rise through the ranks, as we'll see. So basically, once captives became more trusted by the LRA, then they would start to receive military training, and they would begin this process of being transformed from captives into actually being soldiers. And I spoke with the people who trained Dominic Ongwen, but I'm going to use a different quote, just somebody else talking about their own training here, because I think it kind of encapsulates the process that they went through. So he said to me, one of these former LRA fighters, "If I brought you my photo, you could not believe. They, like young children, they used to train us. It was a school for parade that began every day, very early in the morning at 6 a.m. They trained us how a soldier should be, how a leader should be in combat, which rank you start at as soldiers, which guns you use, which procedure you use when you're fighting, assistance for comrades who got injured, those are the major areas of their interest. So obviously they experienced fairly comprehensive military training, which in many ways was pretty similar to what you might get in other rebel groups. They also indoctrinated the captives, indoctrinated the abductees, speaking to them about their mission every day, why they had to fight the UPDF, the Ugandan army, and basically why they were doing what they were doing. The captives were also beaten, well, the captives and the soldiers were also beaten for infractions of the rules. So there was severe discipline in the group. I mean, there still is severe discipline in the group. And they were also told that if they ever tried to escape from the group, they would suffer brutal reprisals, or even that their families would be completely wiped out if they tried to escape. Or sometimes they also told them, often falsely, that their families were already dead, their families had already been killed, perhaps by the Ugandan army. And one of the things that the LRA did quite often as well is that if people tried to escape and they were recaptured, they would often be publicly executed as a message to the other abductees and the other people in the LRA that escape was very dangerous and something they should not attempt. So returning briefly to this person, Angie, that I had mentioned earlier, she basically had to go away for a few years. So she left Dominic Ongwen in somebody else's hands, and she returned eventually to the LRA. Well, she was always in the LRA, but she had to go somewhere else, and then she came back to Dominic's group. And she told me that she was surprised by what she saw when she saw Dominic Ongwen. This was a few years later, so he was probably moving into kind of mid-teenage years at this point. And she said, I found him much changed. He was now a big man with a new rank. He would be sent for missions, and he was commanding people on the front line. So, I mean, I spoke to her about this, and she said that she found it basically quite weird to see this juxtaposition, somebody she had known as a young child who obviously relied on other people for their survival, turning into a commander and somebody who actually would issue orders to other people. And obviously he had become tougher in some sense by this point as well. This person, Angie, eventually did escape from the LRA herself a couple of years later. She was actually sent by Dominic Ongwen to collect people from the field who were cultivating in the field. And Dominic Ongwen always referred to her right till the moment she escaped as Mama, but she escaped when he sent her to collect people from the field. She just basically ran away. So let's move now to talk about Dominic Ongwen as a commander, becoming a commander. So Dominic, the image on the slide, by the way, I'm getting slightly ahead of myself, but the image on the slide is Dominic Ongwen with some UPDF soldiers after he surrendered, but we'll get to that in a moment. So Dominic Ongwen really excelled as a young officer. He was one of Kony's most trusted officers. Of course, the defense has a bit of a different view of this, but it seems that he definitely had a close relationship to Joseph Kony, and this is because he was a ferocious and a brave fighter, and he was also loyal, but he was known to be a very competent commander. And this is definitely one of the themes of that I got out of all the interviews I did with former LRA people. Maybe I interviewed about 60 people who were in the LRA with Dominic Ongwen. So one of them told me, for example, he was indeed a great fighter. He used to shoot using this gun, which is placed on the ground, talking about a big machine gun here, with magazines strapped all over his body. He was very committed to his work. He would fight wholeheartedly. So again, this is something that many people told me. It was also during this period that he eventually became married to several different women. I'm not sure if that's on the slide. Maybe it'll be after I click, I think. But yeah, and these marriages, we'll talk a bit about later, but these marriages were forced marriages. The defense says that he was also forced to marry. The prosecution says, of course, that that was not the case. And forced marriage as an institution is ultimately a form of abuse, and it's one of the charges against Dominic Ongwen as well, this charge of forced marriage. But we'll talk a bit about that in a moment as well. I also interviewed several of his wives. So Dominic Ongwen, as I said, was seen by many of those who were in the LRA as a good fighter, but also as a good commander. And it's interesting to think about what it means to be a good fighter or a good commander. As I said, it referred in some way to the fact that he was quite competent, but he was also seen in some ways being less brutal in his punishments than some of the other commanders. But this perception of Dominic Ongwen, I think, also needs to be understood within the moral framework of the LRA, which really, posits a different version of values. So, for example, when I was interviewing all these former Lord's Resistance Army people, fighters, as well as the so-called bushwives, many of them would tell me Dominic Ongwen never committed atrocities. But then when I would ask more specific questions like, did you ever see Dominic Ongwen kill somebody? Often they came back with more specific answers. So their view of what an atrocity is quite different, I think, than our view. So, for example, killing somebody who was a captured Ugandan army soldier who was considered completely legitimate within the LRA context. So that would not be considered an atrocity, even though in terms of law, it is an atrocity. It's killing a prisoner of war. Also committing acts of brutal reprisal against villages, maybe where one person might have informed on the movements of the LRA to the Ugandan army, is also something that was considered quite legitimate. So we have to consider this interpretation of Dominic Ongwen's, I suppose, his moral liability within the particular moralities of the Lord's Resistance Army. And I think Dominic Ongwen, again, this is disputed between the defense and the prosecution. Even if he was less brutal in his punishments within the group than some of the other commanders, I think he didn't really hesitate to use brutality against people who are considered enemies of the LRA, people outside of the group. So as I mentioned, Dominic was quite close to Joseph Kony. Kony himself is an interesting character, and we're not going to talk much about him now. But one of his former, right-hand people, who was his head of security, told me, for example, that Joseph Kony was like a chameleon. He could change at any time to a different color. So there is this view of Joseph Kony as a very volatile character, and disobeying Joseph Kony certainly could come with severe consequences within the LRA, even for people like Dominic Ongwen. So Ongwen was one of five LRA commanders who was indicted, or rather charged, by the International Criminal Court in 2005, and he was charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this was after Uganda referred the situation to the International Criminal Court. At the time, Dominic Ongwen was quite annoyed by the charges against him, and I think that annoyance has continued up to the present day. And when I say annoyance, he's annoyed because he thinks it's unjust. He thinks other people are more responsible, and that he shouldn't really be the one on trial, for what it's worth. There were other people within the LRA, incidentally, who were also annoyed by the charges, but actually for a different reason. They were annoyed because they thought the fact that Dominic Ongwen might have been charged and not them also kind of diminished their own importance within the group. So Dominic Ongwen did contemplate leaving the LRA many times. I mean, many people have told me stories about this. They've recounted private conversations. I have no real reason to disbelieve all those accounts. I do believe that he probably intended to leave the LRA. He thought about leaving the LRA for many years. However, he did not leave the LRA up until 2014, which is when he ultimately left the LRA and surrendered to the International Criminal Court, although I don't think he thought he was surrendering to the International Criminal Court, but that's a whole other story. But basically, he'd fallen out of favor with Joseph Kony. He was imprisoned by Kony. One of the guards who was supervising him helped him to escape. So let's turn now to the trial itself, and then I'll wrap up. So the trial opened in December of 2016. I was actually at the opening of the trial. There were 70 charges against Dominic Ongwen. This is the most charges against anybody in any international court ever. So it was a lot of charges. These were different war crimes and crimes against humanity relating to his time in the LRA. He was the only one, or he is the only one, being tried at the ICC for the crimes of the LRA. As I mentioned, 5 people were charged. But out of these 5 people, 3 of them have actually died since they were charged. And this is typical in the LRA. People just die in battle. They die of disease or starvation, whatever the case may be, because the conditions are very tough. So 3 have died. Joseph Kony is still at large, probably in the Central African Republic. But Dominic Ongwen is alive and he's in the custody of the court. So he's the one actually effectively being tried for the crimes of the LRA. The charges relate to massacres at 4 internally displaced person camps between 2002 and 2005. So these are internally displaced persons, of course, are people who are refugees but within the country. And Dominic is accused of either ordering these massacres or actually being there at the time of the massacres and leading the troops himself. He's also charged with 2 kind of overarching sets of charges, and these are relating to forced marriage and to the use of child soldiers. So he's charged both with participating in the system of forced marriage, as well as also ordering forced marriages and distributing wives, and it's the same kind of thing for child soldiers as well. He's charged with abducting, or he's accused of abducting children to serve as child soldiers and as eventually as bushwives, as domestic servants. And he also directly abducted these children as well as ordering these abductions. So we see different narratives even at the opening of the trial. So for example, at the opening of the trial, Dominic Ongwen was asked whether he understood the charges against him by the judges, by Judge Schmidt, I believe at that time. And of course, this is something the court will always ask the defendant. And he sort of proceeded to go on a bit of a rant, which he's not really supposed to do. It's kind of a yes-no question. But he said, "This amounts to my going back into the bush a second time. Do you think I am the LRA? Do you agree that my life has been ruined?" And he also went on to say Joseph Kony is the LRA. So he thinks of himself very much as a victim, we can say. But Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, needless to say, had a different perspective. So at the opening, she said that Ongwen had rapid promotion based on his unwavering loyalty and ferocity. So we already get 2 very different narratives of Dominic Ongwen. Did he commit atrocities just as a means of survival, or is it a case that he really excelled at these kinds of atrocities? So again, the central narrative of the prosecution is that Dominic Ongwen could have chosen not to rise in the hierarchy and expose himself to increasingly higher responsibility to implement LRA policies. So Dominic Ongwen was basically, according to the prosecution, he should have left the LRA. Many people left the LRA. Why did he choose not to leave the LRA? The fact that he was abducted as a child isn't so relevant for consideration in the trial itself, according to the main prosecution narrative. The defense obviously has a different view. I mean, we're talking about an adversarial system. So the defense says that Ongwen was a victim and that others are more responsible. At the closing of the trial, for example, Ongwen's chief counsel, Crispus Ayena, repeatedly referred to Ongwen as that boy, even though Dominic Ongwen he's actually a couple of years older than me. He's about give or take about 45 years old, so definitely not a boy. But I think in using this language, the defense was also emphasizing this kind of state of continuing victimization, rather than the idea that's more the prosecution idea that he was a victim at first and he eventually became something else. And I mean, even in the opening statement from the prosecution, they acknowledge that he was a victim, but they then go on to say that he's no longer a victim, that he still has some responsibility, criminal and perhaps moral as well. So the key evidence that's used in the trial is, first of all, insider witnesses. So there are many people who were actually in the LRA who are testifying both for the prosecution and for the defense. And secondly, and maybe more importantly, the use of radio intercepts. So basically, the Ugandan army, the Ugandan government was listening to LRA communications by walkie-talkie at the time during the war, and they recorded a lot of these communications. They made transcripts of them, and this is really the most powerful evidence against Dominic Ongwen, because if it's a witness, perhaps you can argue the witness is unreliable, but it's more difficult to do when you actually hear the voice of Dominic Ongwen, for example, you know, asking his subordinates how an attack went, those kinds of things. So there are several key debates that occurred throughout the trial process. You know, one of the overarching debates was whether the LRA is a conventional military organization, whether it has a chain of command, whether, you know, as would be conventional, information is going up the chain of command and orders are going down the chain of command. And why this is important is because it would mean that Dominic Ongwen was responsible for the acts of his subordinates, for example. Also, what's important, or the key defenses that you see in the trial, are mental illness and duress. So the defense is arguing, you know, to use the language of the Rome Statute, they have to argue that Dominic Ongwen's ability to tell right from wrong was completely destroyed because of mental illness. So they're arguing that Dominic, at the time of the commission of the crimes, as well as today, has really a series of mental illnesses ranging from depression to anxiety to post-traumatic stress disorder to dissociative identity disorder. And something that's really important to keep in mind when we think about mental illness in trials, it's not enough in this kind of forensic sense. It's not enough just to say somebody has a mental illness. It has to be a mental illness which would actually basically destroy the ability to tell right from wrong. So the defense was quite ambitious in terms of the array of mental illnesses that they presented, like dissociative identity disorder, for example, which is really quite a rare condition. I think if he actually did have dissociative identity disorder, it probably could destroy his ability to tell right from wrong, but they actually didn't present much evidence beyond expert witnesses that Dominic Ongwen displayed these conditions. The other key defense and the other key debate is duress. So, of course, the defense is arguing that Dominic Ongwen was coerced, that he was under great danger himself, and that others close to him were under danger, and that he only committed the acts, the criminal acts, the alleged criminal acts, for these reasons. And again, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court says that there has to be an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death to yourself or to another person. So it's not enough that Dominic might have been socialized within this very brutal group. It's not enough that there might have been a very kind of general threat. There had to be something specific, and it has to be tied to each specific charged incident. So it's actually quite difficult to prove, I think, especially given that there are 70 charges against Dominic Ongwen. So I'd like to just conclude now. So obviously we're, as I mentioned at the outset, we're waiting now for a verdict in the trial. Probably a verdict will come in December or in January, I think. The trial ended in March of this year. But just some overarching questions, and maybe these are more on the philosophical side of things, but just thinking about who Dominic Ongwen is as a person. What do we get out of punishing him? Obviously, some of the victims very much support him being prosecuted and him being punished. Some victims are also against it, but he is definitely being treated than other victims and other perpetrators, in fact, within the LRA insurgency. But I think also in thinking about who he is as a person, needless to say, this is a complicated question. I think this is something people often have difficulty wrapping their minds around. Just this very simple fact that people have multiple aspects to their personalities, that people who are ostensibly good people can also sometimes commit atrocities, and that both of these things could be true for Dominic Ongwen. So I'll leave you with the words, I mean, we'll have a question period, but in terms of my presentation, I'll leave you with the words of a former child soldier who was in fact abducted by Dominic Ongwen. And I think his story, there are some parallels here to Dominic Ongwen himself, and he was very close to Ongwen, even to this day, which was, you know, a couple decades later, still sees Dominic Ongwen as a sort of father figure. But he said to me, "I do not have clean hands. So I claim responsibility for certain things, atrocities that I've done under my powers. Likewise, as he had a bigger power, he also has to be responsible for bigger things that he's done. Yes, we understand he was abducted, but he should have resisted some pressure. Certainly, he was also to be held responsible. But his personality also, he was a really good man, a very, very good man. So he was, I said to him, not to put words in your mouth, partly a victim of circumstances. And he agreed with me on that instance. So I'd like to leave you with that, and we'll have a question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. That was fascinating. I know so very little about the International Criminal Court, and so hearing this particular case is, you know, and many of the things that you described, the atrocities, both that he was responsible for, and then part of the circumstances. That's it's unbelievable. I will certainly want to read your book once it is published. So we've had some questions come in. The first one is, how big was the LRA at its peak?
That's a good question. I mean, I would say a few thousand fighters. I'm going to say about 6,000 fighters. Don't quote me on the exact amount, but it's something in that range. It still exists today. I mean, it's something I didn't mention in my talk, but it's very small now. It's probably no more than 300 fighters today. But at one point, it was about 6,000 or so. And it was supported. I mean, really importantly, it was supported by Sudan, by the government of Sudan. So they gave them all kinds of weapons. So they were quite an adept fighting force. And even the fact that Joseph Kony has now been in the bush for decades, and even the Americans haven't been able to catch him. Uganda's tried to catch him. Everybody's tried to catch him. Also says something about how adept they are actually as a guerrilla fighting force. So
he's still leading the LRA, Joseph Kony?
Yep. Yeah, there was a rumor very recently that he wrote a letter to the president, or sent a letter to the president of Uganda, saying that he wanted peace talks. I'm a little bit skeptical of the truth of that rumor. Also, for the government of Uganda, to be honest, I don't think there's much incentive for them to have peace talks, because he's no longer in Uganda. You know, he's in Central African Republic, so he's a ways away from Uganda at the moment, and he's not much of a threat to Uganda. He's still a threat to civilians in the immediate area where they're operating, because they're still abducting people.
Okay, next question. I think this is $1 million question. Do you think he will be convicted, and do you think he should be convicted?
Yeah, I mean, in answer to the first part, I think he will be convicted, not on every charge. I mean, I was just interviewing one of his lawyers the other day, and I asked him the same thing, but of course he wouldn't say, because the verdict hasn't come and he doesn't want to get in any trouble. But he probably also thinks he'll be convicted, just knowing the way things go. But I think the prosecution evidence is pretty solid, and I think they've actually done a pretty good job. They've built their case pretty meticulously. They haven't always done that, but I think in this trial they have. Yeah. So I think he'll be convicted, but probably not on every charge. Probably his sentence will be lessened because of his circumstances. And even, I mean, I think this is a little bit unusual, but the prosecution mentioned that in both their opening and closing statement. The fact that he was a victim, and the fact that this might be a mitigating factor in sentencing. So the prosecution is not, you know, arguing against that fact. And maybe they're even trying to provide that possibility for the judges. I mean, the judges have that possibility anyway, but maybe they're trying to lead them in that direction. But whether he should be convicted, it's a really complicated question. I'm very conflicted, to be honest. I mean, I think if you look at the crimes under the statute and the legal framework of the trial, I think then, yes, he should be convicted. Probably, because I think probably, as I said, the evidence is pretty solid. Having said that, I think any court is fairly myopic in terms of how it looks at the circumstances of an individual. I think courts are pretty, they try for nuance, but I think ultimately they're still pretty blunt instruments in dealing with these things. And on a more kind of moral level, I'm just very conflicted. And I think that will be reflected in my book as well. And I think that's the best way to tell the story, because it is a very complex story. I could tell the story with him just fully as a victim. You know, he went through all these awful things, and I didn't, you know, detail them all in my talk today. But, you know, on the other hand, I've talked to people who were his victims as well. And needless to say, I have some empathy for them as well. But it's not a simple thing to unravel. And I think it's a bit of a fiction, the idea that you're just responsible once you turn 18, which is, I mean, essentially, the age jurisdiction of the court is over the age of 18 years. So they don't take account really of the fact that he was a child and grew up in really a very extreme environment. In that sense, much different than most armies. That there was a lot of violence, a lot of brutality. There was very real fear that if they even thought about escaping, that Joseph Kony would know that they were thinking about escaping, partly because of intelligence and partly because of his powers.
Are there other cases like Dominic that the International Criminal Court is looking at right now that are similar to his, like that are LRA related?
No. I mean, there were 5 people charged, but as I mentioned at the end, I think that 3 of them are dead. And the only one who's left is Joseph Kony and then Dominic Ongwen. And I didn't talk about this in my talk today, but in Uganda, they have an amnesty. So at the national level, so the Ugandan government has given all former LRA soldiers amnesty. That's an important detail. So as of now, they've only prosecuted 1 person at the national level. That trial is still ongoing. Somebody who was also friends with Dominic Ongwen and who was also abducted incidentally. And that's it. So even people, and this is also where it becomes thorny, because even people who were senior to Dominic Ongwen in the command structure have not been charged with any crimes by the Ugandan government or by the International Criminal Court. And of course, I've put this question directly to the prosecution people involved in the investigation, and they usually give me the fairly standard answer that it's because he was the most responsible, which is the language you find in the law. But that might be true, but it's also certainly debatable. I think it's also just a matter of convenience, convenience in the sense that they probably had good evidence on him. They might have had less good evidence on people who were actually more responsible.
Another question that came in is, have other child soldiers been integrated back into their communities, and do their families accept them back?
Yes, many thousands. Whether they're accepted back, of course, is a complicated question. I mean, there was this whole process of amnesty, and people who returned would get, I'm trying to remember exactly what they would get now, but they actually got a package from the government with a bit of money, some basic foodstuffs. They would usually have to go through a kind of reintegration program, and then they would return to their communities. And this actually caused resentment in some of their communities, because in some case, the victims were saying, the non-LRA victims were saying, hey, we didn't get any of these things. You came and you burnt down our village and we didn't get any of these things. So sometimes they're accepted by their families, often actually, but often not as well. It's a complicated scenario. They have local mechanisms as well to reintegrate people in the culture, certain ceremonies and things like that.
Right. Now, I'd asked a little earlier just about LRA, specifically about one question that's come in is, have other child soldiers been prosecuted at the ICC? So maybe with regards to other conflicts that are going around the world, and if yes, were they convicted?
Oh, that's a good question. Now I'm trying to remember. I think Ntaganda, who was somebody from the Congo, I think he was a former child soldier, but again, I have to double check that. But in general, I would say not. There are also some cases from the Special Court for Sierra Leone, but Ntaganda was convicted in that case. But nobody's ever been charged who's under the age of 18. That's not allowed at the ICC. It was allowed at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, but they actually didn't charge anybody under the age of 18. But there are a few people being charged with conscripting children, forcibly conscripting children. But in terms of former child soldiers, I think there could be one other at the ICC, but it's not a common circumstance. It's common that it happens, but in terms of trying them, yeah.
Is there an active search going on right now for Joseph Kony?
Not really.
Not really?
No, that ended really a couple of years ago.
Okay.
The Americans withdrew. Of course, Barack Obama authorized a special mission with, the American Special Forces, and the Americans gave up first, and then the Ugandans also gave up about a year or so ago. So yeah, nobody really is, but he's still posing a threat to civilians. I'm sure the ICC would be happy to have him, but they don't have resources to go and arrest people themselves.
Of course. Right. So I'm just going to ask another question just of myself. And so again, just to remind everyone, please go to Slido if you do have a question for Dr. Anderson. But if we wanted to learn more specifically about this case or about the International Criminal Court, where do you suggest are good resources? What should we do if we want to learn more?
Well, I mean, you could visit the website of the International Criminal Court. I mean, every case has I think they call it a fact sheet, which just will lay out the very basic facts of the case. You can also find videos of the trial itself on YouTube, because a lot of the sessions are, not all of them though, are uploaded to YouTube. But of course, there are some good books as well. There are a couple of books by former LRA people. There's a book by Evelyn Amoni, who was one of the wives of Joseph Kony, also somebody who helped me with my research. And that book came out a couple of years ago. It's called I Am Evelyn Amoni. I think that's a really good book. I mean, it's nice because it tells the kind of insider perspective rather than just somebody like me looking at the outside and telling people's stories. So I would definitely recommend that book. I can't think of any documentaries. I mean, there are some, but any that I really like, yeah, I'd have to think more about that, which I can't do now, but yeah.
Right. Another question that came in is, what is the rationale for the LRA, the resistance, and why are they fighting?
Yeah, I kind of skipped over those things just because of time, but it could be a long story, but basically, I mean, the LRA is mostly people from the Acholi ethnic group, not only people from the Acholi ethnic group, but there's a long history. I won't say a history of antipathy per se, but Uganda's gone through, a few presidents, and the presidents tend to rule in favor of their own ethnic group to some degree. And so I think people in the northern part of Uganda, many of them feel shut out by the central government. And yeah, the reasons for that are complicated. And I think that feeling persists to this day. So the LRA kind of arose out of that context. It also arose out of other groups which disbanded, and then they kind of gathered up those former fighters, and that was kind of the genesis of the LRA. But yeah, so that's the very basic background into why the LRA is fighting. But in terms of really specific ideologies and platforms, you find some of that, but you don't find that lately. I mean, the LRA doesn't talk much lately about why it's fighting. By lately, I mean, the last 5 or 10 years. Now I think it's really focused mostly on its own survival. But originally, they used to talk a lot about the 10 Commandments. So they would say, we want to bring back the 10 Commandments. Of course, I mean, some of the LRA people I was speaking to, I said, well, you already have the 10 Commandments. I mean, or you have a lot of the 10 Commandments in the law, maybe not all of them. Things like adultery, you don't have in the law in that sense in Uganda. But certainly thou shalt not kill is represented in Ugandan law. I mean, you're not allowed to murder people. So, I mean, there was a kind of religious motivation. There was a kind of regional or ethnic motivation as well at the time. But they're not, I also wouldn't call them, strictly speaking, like some Christian fundamentalist group. It's just more complicated than that. They take parts of Christianity. They take parts of Islam, kind of traditional beliefs, and then they have their own beliefs, which are kind of unique. So they're a unique thing, definitely.
That's very interesting. I'll just put a last call out there for questions, but one more question that I have that I was wondering through your presentation, you're speaking about all the different people that you're interviewing for your research. Has Dominic, has he been able to see, has he seen his sister? Has he seen, I think her name, Mama Angie, has he seen these people from his past, or were they part of the trial at all?
Yeah, that's also a complicated question because, I mean, he won't have seen people I don't know, for example, if the person I was calling Mama Angie, I mean, she called herself Mama, but she has a different real name. I don't know if she's testified in the trial. It's something I'm avoiding because I don't want to tamper with witnesses who might be protected, for example. So I actually don't know. If she testified, he would have seen her in the courtroom in The Hague. Which is also kind of weird when you think about it. I mean, just going from this context of being in the bush in Uganda and then suddenly being in The Hague and something that looks, just kind of like a modern office building and eating Dutch food and all these things. I mean, it must be a tremendous shock. Well, I know it's a tremendous shock from talking to people who've spoken with him. But mostly he's been able to meet some traditional leaders who've traveled from Uganda, and he's met some of his former wives and some family members. But that's a complex question because, as I said, he's charged with forced marriage as a crime against humanity. And so he's not allowed to talk to some of these wives because they're considered victims as well. But some of them he is talking to, but it's all kind of confidential. So I might know more than the average person, but I definitely don't know everything in terms of who he's allowed to talk to. But it is definitely restricted. I know his family was unhappy back in Uganda. I mean, I went to his village and spoke to some of his family there, and they because he was only allowed to talk to immediate family and not to people like cousins and uncles, and that's because that's sort of the rules of the court, but that doesn't really match up with Ugandan culture, where they're all considered part of a family. Of course, it's a more collective living arrangement. So,
and I assume he has children. Right, and I assume he has children as well from all of those marriages.
Yes, and he's spoken with some of them, but some of them he's also, I think that's changed recently as well, that his communications have been liberalized a bit, but some of them he hasn't been allowed to talk to. But I know that he has spoken to some of his children. I don't know how many children he has. No, nobody will also tell me. I mean, the people who are in the LRA don't really know how many children he had. They don't know how many wives he had, because, you know, we're talking about it over the course of, I don't know, 20-something years. So some of them might have been there. Let's say they were there from 1987 to 1991. So they know about his wives or children he had in that period. Actually, I don't think he had any in that period, but just for the sake of argument. But they don't know about people that he might have been married to in 2002 or something like that.
Right.
And the defense also won't tell me, and because it's also, it's a sensitive issue given the charges in the trial. You know, how many wives he had, who he was married to, what that actually means. But I did speak to a couple of his wives, and I didn't talk about it really. But I mean, his wives, some of them I think have testified for the prosecution, and some have testified for the defense.
One last final question that just came in is, how was Dominic captured? But if I remember correctly, I think you were saying something about, did he turn himself in?
It's a complicated, I keep saying that, but it is a complicated story because according to the defense, he surrendered, and the prosecution sort of says he was captured, sort of. But what actually happened, just to make a long story short, he was in Central African Republic at that time. He escaped from the group. I think that's indisputed. He was captured by the Seleka rebels, who are a rebel group in Central African Republic, who's also accused of mass atrocities. The United States had a bounty on Dominic Ongwen. They have a bounty on all the at-large people for international crimes. I don't remember what it was now. I think $5 million. But so the Seleka rebels, he surrendered to them. Actually, they say they captured him. He says he surrendered. I think he actually surrendered. And then they tried to get the money from the Americans, and then the Americans didn't want to give them the money because it's kind of a bad look to give money to a group that's themselves involved in very serious human rights violations. And then basically there was a very complex negotiation involving multiple countries between the International Criminal Court, Uganda, the Central African Republic, the United States was in there a little bit, the African Union, over what would happen with Dominic Ongwen. And I think basically nobody wanted to deal with him. They didn't really want to try him in Uganda. If they had said, yes, we'll try him in Uganda, maybe the ICC wouldn't have then tried him, but they didn't say that, obviously, and he was flown to The Hague. But he thought he wasn't surrendering to the ICC, I think, from what I know. I mean, he thought that he was going to go back to Uganda and probably get amnesty, because he also knew that some of the people who left before him, even people who were senior to him, they got amnesty. And so he knew about the charges against him. As I said, you know, he was aware of them, but he still thought that he would probably get amnesty. But he was never promised amnesty by the ICC, obviously.
Right. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. So thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. That was really fascinating. And I encourage everyone to get a copy of the book once it is published later. I think you said next year, right? You were hoping in 2020.
Yeah, I think late next year, probably.
Late next year. Thank you to everybody for participating this afternoon. We will be sending you a link to today's session if you'd like to view it again, as well as a survey where you can share your thoughts and feedback. And please do respond, as it's the only way that we're able to improve. Please join us next week when we hear from Dr. Laurie Kirschenbaum. He is the Director of Research Development and a Canada Research Chair in Molecular Cardiology in the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences and with the Institute of Cardiovascular Sciences at the St. Boniface General Hospital Research Center here in Winnipeg. And he will be speaking on the topic of how to mend a broken heart. So thank you again for spending the last hour with us, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.